session in store for you. I should introduce myself first. I'm Mike Jennings, and I have the great honor to be the chairperson of TASC, which, as you know, is the think tank for action for social change. And many of you will know that we are celebrating our 20th year this year just ending, so we're heading into our 21st. And in fact, we've been promised by no less a personage than the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, that he is going to host a little reception for us to mark our coming of age when we're 21. So we're very, very proud of that. We're very proud generally of all the work we do, and we hope that you, by your participation today, are people that have some knowledge of us, and that after today that you will continue to be to keep in touch with us. We would really like any support that you can give us. Just to remind you, we are a completely independent organization. We value that independence hugely. We think it's essential for the integrity of the research work we do, but it does mean that we rely on our friends for support. So if any of you are minded to be supportive to us in any way, you will see on the chat line during the course of today how you could express that support to us. And just to say, we would really appreciate it. There ended the commercial. I'm not going to do any more appeals such as that. I will just tell you that as you know, the title for the event this afternoon is "How Should Civil Society Respond to the Threats to Democracy?" And our chairperson this afternoon is Joe Saunders. Joe is a very, very important and influential and highly regarded member of the board of TASC. He's also the Chief Executive Officer of the local development, the Irish Local Development Network. Joe, by the wonders of Zoom technology, is down in County Clare in the west of Ireland at the moment. And those of you who live on the island will know that we're experiencing a tremendous weather event at the moment. So my understanding is that as we speak, Joe is in the eye of the storm, quite literally, and we're hoping that the conditions will be favourable. But it may be the case that Joe would have to drop out and drop back in again because of those atmospheric conditions. But with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Joe to introduce all of the panel. I want to thank all of you for your participation. Thank you for your support today to TASC, and I hope you enjoy the conference. I think it's going to be very challenging. Over to you, Joe.
So thank you so much, Mike. And you're all very welcome to the TASC Annual Lecture 2021 on this, our 20th anniversary. I'd like to thank everybody, first of all, who helped to sustain us for those first 20 years and express the, I suppose, genuine hope that we have repaid that trust by producing robust research that has facilitated civil society organizations to better advocate for social justice, for inclusion and transparency. And those are very much our themes today. I'd like also to thank those authors, campaigners and activists who have answered our call to speak at our talks, our webinars, and indeed our annual lectures over the past 2 decades. The annual lecture itself has become a roll call, if you like, of progressive doers and thinkers, and indeed those who both do and think, and who have had a profound influence on Irish life. Last year, we heard journalist, or the year before, Jack Schenker shining a light on institutional denial of rights. We've had Senator Lynn Ruane, whose work on educational access has been profound. Fintan O'Toole's ongoing critiques of the Irish state and society. Ellen O'Malley Dunlop's call out on gender inequality and violence. Peter McVerry on homelessness. Mary Robinson, David Begg on global relations and global justice. So we can safely say, and I think proudly say, that the TASC annual lecture series has not just mirrored the great social justice questions of the past 2 decades, but has also helped to set and shape the debate from an early stage on those key issues. Tonight, this afternoon, or wherever you are, and I do hope you're safe, wherever that might be, our themes continue this trend today. But before we get to that part of the proceedings, just want to say a further word of welcome and maybe just to reflect on on the one hand, the strangeness, but now the evolving normality of the medium we are using this evening, and our online connectedness and in some sense disconnectedness. So just to say, we have guests from almost everywhere, from universities, civil society organizations, political representatives, embassies, government bodies. So whilst we are in cyberspace and we do have a global theme, I might just point out that TASC is based in Dublin, Ireland, and I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Dublin's first citizen, Lord Mayor Alison Gilliland. So in some way, we I suppose, appreciate that reflection on the role that the TASC annual lecture is seen by political and civil society in Ireland. So I don't want to take up your time any longer before we get to our four key speakers. And indeed, we have a panel this evening that reflects and plays a major role in changing, shaping the debate on the key issue of democracy, its the threats to it, its evolution, and its defenses. So our first speaker is Lisa Prendergast. Bearing in mind, how should civil society respond to threats to democracy? Lisa will give us an international and US perspective. She serves as Vice President of Strategy and Technical Leadership at Democracy International. She is author of Confronting a Global Democracy Recession. Interesting phrase, the global democracy recession, and the role of the United States in international democracy support programs. She has lectured on civil society, civic education, and governance at many well-known institutions, colleges, and we're delighted that she has responded to our request to address you this evening. So our first speaker is Lisa Prendergast, and Lisa, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe. I'm really honored to be here today and really looking forward to this conversation. I'm grateful to my colleague and friend, Ivan Doherty, for introducing me to this organization, to its leaders and members, and to other folks who have joined from around the world. I also recognize the good company of the expert panel, and I'm excited to hear from them and their perspectives. I agree with Joe, and I wish we were able to convene in person. And with apologies to British Romantic poet John Keats, I would quote my favorite, relatively early poem of his, To Hope. When by my solitary hearth I sit and hateful thoughts enwrap my soul in gloom, when we cannot meet together in person, at least life now presents on Zoom. I hope he wouldn't mind that slightly modern update to his poem, but I look forward to meeting all of you in person. I am a democratic practitioner, and as Joe shared, I serve as Vice President at Democracy International. And very briefly, so you understand where I'm coming from in my perspective in responding to these questions, I have advocated in the US Congress to support education for the Education for Democracy Act, which has resulted in more than $200 million in federal funding for civic education, including with partners across the United States and in Ireland in partnership with Cooperation Ireland and others. And for the last 15 years, I've supported democratic transitions around the world, working with civil society organizations in established, emerging, and unfortunately now we're seeing increasingly backsliding democracies. Just a handful of the countries that I've worked in supporting civil society organizations include Tunisia, Egypt, Myanmar, and South Sudan at periods when we were more hopeful for their country's democratic trajectories. In Serbia, Bosnia, and Belarus, learning from some of the leading civil society actors who used strategy and tactics to cajole, partner, and otherwise advance democratic laws and norms in challenging and sometimes violent periods in their histories. I've worked with civil society partners from Argentina and Algeria to Trinidad and Tobago, focused on civic engagement and responding to the increasingly dire crisis in Venezuela. And then just lastly, over the last 20 years, I worked in my home in the United States to improve civic education and to improve democratic elections. So briefly before addressing the two questions that we've been charged with today, I'd like to start with some relatively good news. As you all know, compared with any time in history, arguably, citizens and civil society organizations across the world have access to significant and good research, information, and raw data to understand and analyze the state of democracy in their countries. We, as participants on this call, also have access to incredibly strong analysis from organizations and academic experts that we'll also hear from today, who monitor laws and legislation that inhibit or restrict civil society, among other related issues. Of course, the bad news that we read about every day is that the experts agree that democracy is struggling. Freedom House says democracy is under siege. The Variety of Democracy Index notes that only 14% of the world, the population of the world, live in countries defined as liberal democracies. And reports from International IDEA, their Global State of Democracy report, the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, ICNL, their Civic Freedom Monitor have similarly bad news stories. Democracy is in retreat, warned Washington Post editorial page editor Fred Hyatt in 2016. And today I dedicate my remarks to his legacy after his sudden and unexpected death last week. I'm sorry to say that it appears that his words are as true today as they were then when he wrote them at the end of President Obama's term. Unfortunately, our collective knowledge, though, of this topic of democracy has not sufficiently translated into action. And we also know that the most vulnerable are often left out of these data sets and surveys, particularly in many of the countries that we support, where women, for example, do not have equal access to the digital space. And then a final framing comment for my response to the questions. We stand this week on the precipice of a democracy summit. US President Joe Biden is seeking to reassert the commitment of the US to improve its own democracy and stand with what some are calling a league of democracies, others are calling a concert of democracies, which includes those democracies that are struggling and those that are strong, to recommit to human rights, fight corruption, and push back against authoritarianism. So I wanted to sort of provide that framing and turn to the first question: what can civil society do to respond, and should CSOs in countries like Ireland do to help counterparts in other countries? John F. Kennedy, one of the most famous Irish Americans, said that in 1963, the protection of our rights can endure no longer than the performance of our responsibilities. And to me, that's why we're here today, discussing the role that civil society can and must play to protect and uphold democratic governance, and the role that each of us can play to support democratic advocates around the world, seek, claim, and practice their fundamental political, social, economic, and other rights. So what can we do? First, and Ireland is a model for this, standing in solidarity with civil society partners that share our most fundamental democratic values. We can use rhetoric that is supportive of them. We can call out non-democratic actions by governments. And I think there's no better case study of this than my Irish friends, some on this call, who advocated and spoke out against apartheid in South Africa many years ago, putting pressure on Western governments to make South Africa a pariah state until it transitioned in 1994. And I think we can continue to learn from that to face today's most critical crises. I think this role is particularly significant for internationals to play when civil society activists in countries are sounding the alarm and nothing is changing. So we see in Hungary and the Philippines, for example, civil society groups that have sounded the alarm for a long time. And despite the international community standing in solidarity with them now, we were late to that. And frankly, unfortunately, democratic backsliding has not only continued, but in fact worsened. Second, we can leverage our own governments, private sector actors, pop stars, sports stars, religious leaders, and others, again, Ireland being a model in this, to support or at least not get in the way of democratic civil society actors around the world. In my personal and professional capacity, this usually involves speaking with the US Agency for International Development, US Department of State, members of Congress, and their staff. And one particularly critical example of this working well in the United States is when the previous presidential administration proposed really draconian cuts to foreign assistance, including assistance that supported civil society, human rights globally. It would have essentially gutted that support that USAID provides. And based on an incredible coalition of civil society organizations, of faith-based leaders, retired military professionals, and former diplomats across the major political parties in the United States, they issued a series of public letters and reached members of Congress to rebuke that effort. And they were successful. Congress largely ignored the administration's funding request, but without that civil society engagement, it very much could have gone the other way. Third, we have a responsibility to support civil society organizations that are led by and serve the most vulnerable, who are most adversely affected by democratic backsliding, and a responsibility to stand with human rights defenders in situations where they're not free to act themselves. And there are many ways to do so that I know people on this call are engaged in. A few in particular are to really analyze data and evidence and help CSOs turn that data into policy recommendations and arguments. I think this is particularly helpful for democratic systems where civil society organizations can use the law to push their cause. And one very sort of concrete example, I've worked for nearly 2 decades to try to support civil society organizations around the world advocate in the US Congress for policies that open democratic laws and norms. And one particular example of this effort is the passage of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act in the US Congress, which enables the US president to impose economic sanctions on human rights abusers. And it resulted directly by a series of partnerships actually between the civil society and business community and members of Congress. So turning to the second question, and there's so much we could talk about in that first question, but turning to the second question, what is the role of CSOs in supporting democracy when its future is uncertain? So I think we have to unpack uncertainty to answer this question. Each country is unique, and from an international perspective, the confluence of democratic backsliding and political transitions affect each country very differently. So to unpack uncertainty, I wanted to propose 3 scenarios and propose ways that CSOs can support democracy or democratization in those climates. So the first scenario that I would pose to you today is if a democratic future is uncertain because a democratically elected government and the specific individuals in power are using the law to undermine the system itself, or if they are going outside the law to achieve non-democratic ends. And I'm thinking particularly in this scenario of countries like Hungary and the Philippines that I mentioned, but I'm also thinking of the January 6th crisis and broader election crisis in the United States. So tools for civil society to use in this scenario, and these are well used around the world and effective and can be effective, include mapping personal and patronage networks of those in power. Sometimes that's very dangerous, as we've seen, for example, with Navalny's work in Russia, with the publishing of the Panama Papers and similar efforts to track and expose illicit money flows. Another really strong example of this is journalist Ben Judah's film focused on London called Russia with Cash, which exposes the often unwitting role that real estate agents in the UK in money are facilitating laundering money from autocrats through real estate deals, and organizations or efforts like the Kleptocracy Initiative, for example. There are so much rich detail that we can learn from those doing that critical and important work, and I think it's something that we can build on in the future. Another often overlooked tool, though not by people on this call, I'm sure, is looking for those alliances within government. And I think it's much more intriguing to look for potential whistleblowers who share concerns, but and help journalists expose that information. But I think most of the time it's much less glamorous, and it's really helping allies in government, and we're seeing this increasingly in the United States, to make their case to each other and to those elected and appointed in power to uphold democratic norms and laws. And we do a lot of work related to integrating behavioral economics at Democracy International and behavior change insights into our work supporting democratization. And there are lots of insights from behavioral economics, like peer pressure, that show that this can influence positive action from within government. So helping people have those tools. The second scenario I would propose, so that's the scenario of if a democratically elected government, individuals turn against democracy. The second is the outright rejection of democracy by those in power. It's incredible how many countries believe that they need to hold a facade of elections, these electoral democracies, I'm thinking Belarus, for example, to present a facade of democracy. And in these cases, civil society in democratic countries, in my opinion, has first the responsibility to do no harm, and second, the responsibility to keep pressure on our own governments to act. So by freezing assets of individuals, I mentioned passing the Magnitsky legislation and enforcing it, and listening to the voices of civil society actors who are advocating for specific redress, and working on specific steps to help protect those in the countries that we're supporting. So for example, keeping out in front the names of jailed journalists and individuals in the public domain to help protect them, so that the regimes know that there will be attention paid and consequences for them, not just as sort of a government, but potentially as individuals later. And then the last scenario, and I'll close my remarks, the third scenario is the most concerning to me, which is when people themselves lose faith or have lost faith that democracy can deliver for them. And one of the quotes that I used to like a lot more than I do now, because I think it's really true, is Justice Learned Hand said, a version of, "If liberty dies in the hearts of men and women, no law or court can save it." And I think that's some of the most important work that we have moving forward. If you look at research from Yascha Mounk and others, for example, which shows that in many countries, young people are turning away from democracy. And there are other studies that contradict this, but if Yascha Mounk's research is accurate, to me, ensuring that we pass on the civic knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors of democracy to the next generation is one of the single greatest challenges of our time. And those of us who live in democratic systems, even struggling ones, are required to engage to reach every person that we possibly can with this civic knowledge. And there are civic education organizations in every country in the world, and finding those and sharing your values from your solidarity, your donations, your technical time, and connecting them with experts, I think is incredibly meaningful and something that we need to dedicate the next 20 years to. So thank you very much for asking me to open. I look forward to the conversation moving forward, and I'm happy to turn it back to Joe.
So thanks very much for that, Lisa. Particularly grateful and thankful to you for bringing the theoretical aspects of threats to democracy and the possible responses to them down to a practical level, and speaking about citizens and journalists and where we can actually see the manifestations of these dangers and where we can actually intervene to try and do something about it. So thanks very much for that. Just a word on housekeeping. We have 4 speakers. We're going to let each speaker give their address, and then we're going to come back to you, Lisa and colleagues, for some questions and answers. Just to say, the chat function is alive and open and will be the basis for our questions later. So I know, again, coming back to the strangeness of our medium, it is our one way to try and get people interacting with the process. So we hope we can have a lively discussion later on. So just encourage you to use the chat function for that. Professor David Farrell is our next speaker. David is professor in the School of Politics and International Relations in University College Dublin, and his work currently is mainly focused on the concept of deliberative mini publics. And to date, he has advised 6 government-led processes on this very concept in Ireland, in the UK, and in Belgium. And most recently has provided support for one of the citizen panels of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So David has also been working and researching on the whole notion of citizen assemblies here in Ireland and how they might work, possibly as a bulwark to the kind of threats we're talking about. So David, all yours. I see your slides are up and you're ready to go, so you're welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really grateful, like Lisa, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to the meeting today. So thank you very much. I'll try and keep my remarks brief. I'm just going to start with a very depressing picture, which will be familiar to all of us, I've no doubt, of just what a sorry state democracy on occasions can seem to be in. But perhaps slightly differently from Lisa, I want to suggest to you that it may not necessarily be that democracy is completely doomed, and I'm happy to go into reasons why I might hold that slightly less negative perspective in the Q&A later. I tend to be a little bit more glass half full about these things. On occasions when I see what was going on in the United States under the previous administration, I must admit I was a little bit more depressed perhaps. But on the whole, I think there is enough evidence to suggest that democracies don't stand still, that democracies are continuously innovating. And my brief, as was laid out by Joe in the introduction, was to look at one prominent example of innovation by democracies, which is the role of citizens' assemblies. So let me say a little bit about citizens' assemblies, a bit about the Irish story, a bit about where this fits internationally. And then at the end of my remarks, I want to sort of relate this to the question of the role of civil society. So I'll sort of come to the crunch point at the end, if that makes sense. So citizens' assemblies, sorry, my slide's moving a bit. Citizens' assemblies are, they're a form of what we in political science will refers to as deliberative mini publics. So a citizens' assembly is a type of deliberative mini public. And there are various other forms. There are citizens' juries, there are deliberative polls, there are consensus conferences, and so on and so forth. but citizens' assemblies are perhaps the most prominent of them. And what all of these kind of processes share in common is that citizens are at the heart of this. Regular citizens, sometimes referred to dismissively as ordinary citizens, but regular citizens, citizens selected randomly. So in a sense, what you're trying to get here is that get at unorganized society. Civil society groups are a way in which you try to bring various different organizations across civil society together in participatory processes to debate and promote reform agendas. In the case of a citizens' assembly, you're snatching in a lottery a bunch of random selection of citizens. You're then bringing experts into the room to bring those citizens up to speed on the topic that they've been invited to discuss and make recommendations on. And then you're allowing a process of facilitated deliberation where those citizens are able to have discussions as equals in a calm, reflective, informed process. That's the heart of a citizens' assembly. And the picture there shows you the world's first citizens' assemblies from the early part of this millennium in Canada and the Netherlands. But other forms of deliberative mini-publics go right back to the 70s, and indeed in some way or another go right back to ancient Greece. But that's a scale error. I'm not going into that today. Ireland, though, is seen as a trailblazer because we've had a number of these citizens' assemblies since 2012. The Convention on the Constitution that was set up in 2012, to all intents and purposes, was a citizens' assembly. What was different about it was it included some politicians, but otherwise it was, again, regular citizens selected at random. Then from 2016 to 2018, we had the Citizens' Assembly with the now much more familiar green logo that is associated with this particular activity. And then most recently in 2020 to earlier this year, we've had the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality. So Ireland has stood out over the last decade now as a trailblazer in having had so many of these things. There's a strong good story here, but as I'll suggest later on, perhaps also there's another story that's not quite so positive, but I'll come to that. So it's a story that shows real outcomes, and this is why Ireland has stood out as a beacon, because there have been a number of outcomes, which of course have had all sorts of reasons why those outcomes have occurred. The role of civil society has been at the heart of many of these things, but there have been certain game-changing moments, and particularly in the case of the marriage equality and abortion referendums, this has been remarked on by quite a number of people, that the role of the Convention on the Constitution in the first instance and the Citizens' Assembly in the second in providing that atmosphere for politicians to consider the possibility of having the referendums and for those referendums to go through successfully was very important. And as you can see on the slide, there are a number of other outcomes that have followed recommendations of processes like this. But not all recommendations have been accepted. And I want to come back to that point a little bit later on. So Ireland stands out as a beacon. Here's the evidence for me to say that. It's because if you look at the data from some incredibly important research that's been done by the OECD, this slide is from a most recent update of an OECD report that was published a year ago that shows what it refers to as in the title of its own report, the deliberative wave that swept across the world's democracies, not just the OECD cases. And it's a wave that dates from 2010, 2011. It dates from the Irish experience. Ireland was on the crest of that wave. And what you tended to find in the years immediately following the first of those Irish processes were senior civil servants and senior politicians from other countries coming to Ireland and talking to folk here about the Irish experience and learning lessons of how it was done in Ireland. And in a sense, then Ireland passed on this good practice to a number of these other countries, so that increasingly it's now being used. And I just give you an example. Across the water in the United Kingdom, they've had up to about 40 of these processes in the last 4 years at local level, municipal level, at regional level and national level. So it's catching on everywhere. Almost every day one hears about another case of something like a citizens' assembly. And so what we're beginning to see now is this is becoming embedded. I was just checking because I had forgotten all the details of the program for government of the 2020 elected government, the current government. And in that program for government, it talks about up to 4 or 5 more citizens' assemblies that supposedly are going to happen sometime in the next 2 to 3 years on whether Dublin should have an elected mayor, on biodiversity, on the question of drugs use, on reform of our education system, and other topics have been suggested. And what these all speak to is an Irish model that's becoming embedded. The rough diagram is sort of a politics 101 kind of diagram, where you can sort of see what seems to have evolved now. And it's evolved rather than being institutionally designed. This sort of sense that, the Dáil is, and the Oireachtas generally is dealing with an issue where perhaps they might need to let another body take some time to reflect on this. So this is the model that we had in the case of the abortion topic. Oireachtas after Oireachtas sessions were discussing abortion and never managing to come to some reasonable resolution, and referendums were being attempted and none of them were working until 2016, when it was given to a citizens' assembly. It was given a brief, it was given a resource, it was given sufficient time to produce a report. That report went back to a special all-party committee of the Oireachtas, back to the plenary of the Oireachtas, and then to a referendum that went through. So you got something that really looks rather attractive, something that tells a pretty good story about an important democratic innovation that seems to be settling quite well, embedding within the Irish case, and is catching on internationally as well. So that's the good news. It seems to be working, but there are some worrying signs. And I think the worrying sign is this. I think it is, we have a situation where politicians in Ireland, particularly the leaderships of many of the parties, have become quite comfortable with the idea of a citizens' assembly. They see it as a device that can be used. And regularly you'll see op-eds being written by prominent politicians and indeed prominent journalists saying we should have another citizens' assembly on, name your topic. So that's good. That's the good side of the story, that people are becoming comfortable, and particularly senior politicians are becoming comfortable. But the bad side of that is the fact that they are becoming comfortable, because what you get with that is the risk of capture by government, and in particular by senior civil servants. You get the possibility that this device is being used in a way that is bringing comfort to politicians because they like the way it's working, they like the way it's helping them to get through difficult conundrums, difficult policy problems. But the problem with that is it doesn't confront them, it doesn't challenge them, it doesn't shake things up. And that isn't a very good situation to find ourselves in. So I've given you on the slide there some suggestions of some of the more obvious weaknesses of the Irish approach currently. The agenda of the Citizens' Assembly is set by the government of the day. That's it. The agenda then having been set is then given to this new Citizens' Assembly that is managed by senior civil servants seconded from other duties and managed very tightly in a very top-down model, quite different from what we're seeing in a number of other cases where citizens' assemblies are being used. So it's tightly controlled. And then it produces output. And then we have to see what happens to that output, because as I suggested earlier on to you, there are good examples of where the output is implemented, but there are also good examples of where the output is ignored. And I don't want to suggest here that this sense of the comfort surrounding the use of citizens' assemblies means that I'm advocating that politicians need to be got out of the way. I'm not trying to suggest, there would be others who might make this argument, that we need to replace representative democracy with a citizens' assembly. We need to in some way sideline elected politicians. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. I'm just saying that citizens' assemblies and other deliberative processes like this should be used as a useful bolt-on, a useful addition to support our representative system. But that must be done in a way in which they are being listened to. They're not being ignored. Because if you ignore the output of these citizens' assemblies, you get into a problem. So this is my last slide. What I want to mention to you, at least as in passing, is there are very good examples of citizens' assembly type processes in a number of other jurisdictions right now that show how well-run deliberative process can work side by side with politicians. On the slide there is a summary of one model that's been used in a part of Belgium, the Ost-Belgian model it's referred to. and there's a link there to a report that says more about it. But this is a model that's been used by the German-speaking community in Belgium. And you'd need time, it would need time for me to explain this, but the essence of it is that the agenda for a Citizens' Assembly is set by a Citizens' Assembly. The Citizens' Assembly then produces a report that's sent to the Parliament. The Parliament is not obliged to accept that report, but where the Parliament disagrees, it must meet with the members of the Citizens' Assembly and discuss with them why it disagrees with them. It shouldn't sideline the report. It shouldn't ignore the report. And that's what I'm trying to suggest here, that there's good examples in Belgium, in Scotland. The Paris City Council that's just established a permanent Citizens' Assembly is another good example of how this thing can be done. And so this is the question for civil society that I want to end with. I certainly find it wonderful that senior politicians and journalists and civil society groups are calling for more of these sort of processes in Ireland. But I'd like to suggest that the next thing that should be done is don't just call for a Citizens' Assembly. Call for a Citizens' Assembly that follows better practice in other countries. Let's try and improve how we run things like this in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for your straight putting out there of, I suppose, the benefits of the model, but how the model may actually be curtailed, tightly managed, or what you described as approached in a top-down manner. So it's not just putting forward models, it's how we actually implement them. So that's a very practical concern, again, for us. So thanks for that contribution. Our next speaker is Richard Youngs. Richard is the author of the recently published Rebuilding European Democracy. In a teaser article in The Guardian earlier in the year, he communicated very directly to say that the past decade has been a bruising one for the health of European democracy, and that nearly all European governments have chipped away at civil liberties, judicial independence, and civil society. The narrative of democracy laboring in deep crisis is now well established. So these are quite strong statements, which I'm hoping Richard will elaborate on. And I suppose on a more optimistic note, he has noted that as the threats have mounted, so have efforts to defend and rethink Europe's democratic practices. So I suppose that's a fascinating teaser into what you might say, Richard, and it's all yours now, and I look forward to your contribution.
Thank you, and then thank you very much for the invitation to join you this afternoon. Actually, my reflections are very much in line with David's half glass full perspective. I think Lisa laid out a very excellent and comprehensive range of policy options for how civil society can be strengthened in its efforts to defend democratic norms in Europe and across the world. I would take a step back and make a more empirical point that it seems to me that in many countries, again, globally and in Europe, civil society has already been organizing with increasingly assertive dynamism to defend democratic norms. We know it's been a really bad decade for democracy in many countries around the world. And democracy is under all kinds of unprecedented stresses and strains. But it's also been a decade in which civil society actors have really stepped up and become more dynamic and outspoken in defense of democratic norms. And I think the fact that civil society has already begun to deepen these efforts, intensify these efforts, helps explain why the collapse of democracy has not been even more dramatic than it perhaps could have been. In particular, in Europe, for example, analysts have been predicting a very dramatic collapse of democracy for many years. And democracy has been weakened in many, many ways, but it's also shown a degree of resilience as well. And it seems to me that civil society has played its role in that resilience. For me, the interesting thing is that these civil society efforts have taken place at lots of different levels. When we talk about civil society pushing back against democratic decay, we're not talking about one form of civil society activity only. The significant thing to me is that these civil society efforts are taking place at lots of different levels simultaneously. Some is very spontaneous and fluid, some is more structured and top-down, some involves large numbers of activists mobilizing on the streets, others involve smaller groups of citizens. It seems to me at all these levels, the tactics deployed by civil society organizations have improved over the last decade. One shouldn't be overly idealistic. A lot of civil society activity is not necessarily about democracy. Some of it is not very liberal. Not all of it is good news for democracy. But at least some of it has mobilized specifically with the intention of pushing back against the kind of illiberal democratic erosion we've witnessed in recent years. There's lots of good news then. I'm very much in line with David here. Good news to offset the bad news. But at the same time, it seems to me all these different levels of civil society, pro-democratic civil society activity also show weaknesses. So if we break down the different levels of civil society efforts, there have been huge numbers of protests, mass protests around the world, civil society coming out onto the streets, often in fairly spontaneous fashion, often linked with fairly fluid social movements. The density of social movements across the world is far stronger and denser today than it was a decade ago. We've seen these protests in every region of the world, in every kind of political regime. They've been particularly dense in Europe, in countries like Romania and Bulgaria. They've helped hold at bay fairly illiberal authoritarian dynamics. In countries like Italy and Spain, they've also brought various reform options into play as well, and had some effect, some liberal effect on political trends as well. So we see an unprecedented uptick in the intensity of mass protests around the world. We also see a far more dense and dynamic formal sphere of civil society. Formally organized CSOs have become more active in pushing back against restrictions to civil rights, in pushing back against corruption. In the last year and a half, an unprecedented density of social networks have gathered in relation to the COVID dynamic. Civil society at the community level has organized extremely impressively in many countries around the world to help deal with the health emergency. And moreover, many of these civil society organizations have not been static. They've developed new kinds of tactics. A whole new form of civic activism has emerged around the world. This is one of the things we've been tracking in the Carnegie think tank that I work for. So in both quantitative and qualitative terms, the nature of civic activism has changed and made a contribution to holding at bay authoritarian dynamics. We see a new phase of digital activism as well. There was a first phase of digital activism 10 or 15 years ago. People were very optimistic about the empowering value of online mobilization. And we moved into a far more pessimistic phase where digital technology seems to have been almost a kind of intrinsic problem to democracy around the world. I think we're now moving into a new phase where we see a burgeoning world of new types of democratic activism, trying to marry the best of online and offline civic activity. And that's opened up quite an exciting new range of possibilities for civil society action. And then in the world of deliberation, of which I think that David is the absolute master here, so I don't tread on his terrain, but just to make the point that all this world of small scale deliberation that he talks about, it has very, very tentatively, I think, also begun to find its way into the civic sphere as well. Most of the examples he talks about and has been very, very influential in supporting are run by governments and public authorities, but at least in a few cases, they're actually coming from the bottom up. They're coming from civil society organizations. And in a very, very exploratory way, some civil society organizations, at least, are beginning to explore ways of getting the kind of deliberative dynamics he talks about into civil society activity itself. And I think that, again, this could be a very exciting development. And the final layer of activity I would talk about in this sense is that of party politics. there have been efforts to try and bring in some of the dynamics of deliberation and social movements into the sphere of party politics as well. In particular, in Europe, we've seen the emergence of new kinds of political parties that try and marry the best of formal party politics with the best of civil society activism as well. Hasn't always been successful. Many of these parties have emerged and then kind of flattered to deceive to some extent, but at least in some countries, we're seeing the emergence of new types of political parties. So in a way, I finish here, in a way, I kind of add to Lisa's picture in saying I agree with all the policy options that she maps out, and really saying, I think there's a lot of potential there to follow the kind of recipes she is suggesting and that David is suggesting, because I think a lot of these dynamics are there and they've begun to accumulate and gain traction over the last several years. My more critical perspective would be that a lot of these efforts are very valuable, but they're still quite scattered, they're still quite fragmented, they're still quite small scale, and they're not really joined up enough to have a major political impact. So the one kind of overarching suggestion I would make in terms of what should be done within civil society is that it seems to me we need a kind of really holistic, comprehensive attempt to join together the best of all these different layers of civil society activity. It seems to me all these different layers have their own important role to play in shoring up democratic norms, whether it's protests, formal civil society campaigns, deliberation, online activism, social movement dynamics entering into the world of party politics, etc., etc. For me, the future is not one of one particular type of civic organization, but trying to make sure all these different dynamics really feed into something that is capable of having a much more decisive impact on what both Lisa and David mentioned, which is the fact that democracy is still in a very fragile situation and needs much more, I think, civic attention to repair its shortcomings. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much for that contribution. And I'm going to move straight on to our next and final speaker, which is Alice Mary Higgins. Senator Higgins is, I suppose, known for a strong commitment to equality, environment, human rights, and civil society concerns. She was recently, or last time out, re-elected again to the Irish Senate, Shannon Aaron, in March 2020. And there she is the leader of the Civil Engagement Group, which has particular resonance today because they are a group of senators who each have backgrounds in civil society. She's a member of multiple Oireachtas committees, but is also a member of the Irish delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the Irish delegation to the Conference on the Future of Europe. And I suppose, being the only parliamentarian on our panel this evening, Senator Higgins's contribution, but also her response to some of the issues already laid out, will be fascinating for us. So, Senator Higgins, you're very welcome, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be part of this discussion. I think it's a crucial one. So as was mentioned, I lead the Civil Engagement Group in the Shannon, which is probably one of those new kinds of political entities that Richard was mentioning. And we all come from civil society backgrounds. My own background would have been with the National Women's Council of Ireland before, with Trócaire in areas like climate change and with Older and Bolder. So that's certainly a reason that I'm very passionate for the role that civil society can play and the connection with democracy. And I would agree that democracy is under siege and is facing threats. And I would maybe add to it, multilateralism is also, which is a kind of part of that under threat. And if we look at democracy and that very basic principle of, which I always say when I'm trying to get people to get engaged or excited about legislation or policy, is that policy is ultimately the decisions we make about how we want to live together. That democracy is the quite radical and important idea that, you know, those should be collective decisions. They should be collectively owned, collectively accessed, those decisions about how we live together. And multilateralism, again, is that idea of having greater equality of voice, greater diversity of voice, leading to better outcomes. So I think that that's kind of a frame for me, even in the most pessimistic times. And I think there are dark, there are difficult times, but also I think it's also quite an empowering frame to remember. I was going to ask to kind of talk a little bit about the European side and then around the Irish side. So I'll just talk very briefly around the Future of Europe piece, because I think it's interesting. And I think the Future of Europe process that's happening at the moment, I won't go into great depth, but effectively this is a conversation around what's next for Europe, recognizing Europe's at a crossroads. It was initiated by the three parts, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council. And it's running an 8-month period. And it has within it a couple of unique elements, citizens' assemblies, which I'm not going to presume to talk about. I'm sure David might come in more around those citizens' assemblies in the European Future of Europe that have been inspired a little bit by what Ireland has done. And also it has national parliamentarians. But I suppose I want to talk about why I think this process is happening at the moment, the Future of Europe. And it is because, as Professor Youngs described, we lost a lot of time. A lot of ground was lost in the last decade, right across Europe. And it was very clear during the period of austerity, and this is why sometimes there's a frustration when we have, European politicians saying we want to hear from citizens, when civil society organizations made up of citizens who are experts in their areas of passion had been raising flags, raising concerns, highlighting, for example, the impact of moving funding away from social cohesion, saying that if you disconnect people from their impact on decision making, if they're voting for governments and then you're tying the hands of those governments in being able to reflect, for example, public investment in essential public services, that you fray the connection between citizens and those they elect. Those flags were very early, and even looking to Hungary and Poland, because I would have been with the National Women's Council and the European Women's Lobby about 8 years ago, when there were very clear flags from civil society groups in Hungary and Poland about the direction of travel, about what was happening. And those flags were being raised and unfortunately not listened to. So I think that's the context of why we now have this Future of Europe process. We have to approach positively and do what we can with it, but it's going to be really difficult and quite interesting because there's a lot at stake. And there is also a dynamic of some of the conversations I've even heard from very senior figures within the process is, Europe as a new superpower, how does it stack up against other superpowers? So there's really fundamental choices about, is this a politics solely of power or is it a politics of principle? That's a really important choice. And civil society components within the process have been, and indeed citizens, have been really strong about saying, actually what we value within the European principle is we value these core values, these core principles, the idea of rights. That's what makes us connect. And I think I was very struck by what Liz said about, if liberty doesn't live in the heart. I think actually a lot of the best strengths for Europe are where there is a distributive ownership of certain principles. And I think GDPR was a really good example of that, actually, in terms of picking up on the digital part, whereby you had the idea of data protection rights, not just data protection, given solely to the state, not left to the market, the idea of it being a rights-based frame that is owned by everybody. And we've seen on GDPR, for example, that it's civil society that are insisting on the laws being held and followed through and in being implemented in a meaningful way. And we see that in lots of areas. We see it on climate and environment. It has been civil society that has insisted on the interpretation of the democratically agreed laws and have seen themselves as guardians of it and have taken that to the courts when we've had an erosion of the decisions which were made democratically in that area. And I think that's a really important and maybe a strong thing, an important thing, but it is also, I think, something we can't be at all complacent about. And I'm sure we might discuss more the citizen assembly component on that, but that idea of agenda setting is really important. And there's also within very strong civil society talking about the fact of those goals, those social, for example, the idea of a social progress protocol has been discussed, being driven by unions, but also by NGOs. The idea of strengthening the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Those are the debates. But again, I would say this in the context of saying there's also a lot of very, very regressive debates. There's a lot of debates of rolling down back towards a fortress Europe, of curtailing rights, of narrowing things down to the economic. And I think this is a core issue in all of our talk about civil society, is what part of the decision making are you getting involved with? So for example, if we end up with financial constraints that again mean that the things that people have engaged with this process to say are important that civil societies engage with, if we move back to a situation whereby those points get lost at the end of this process, or those points get fitted into a separately negotiated set of fiscal constraints, then we're going to have lost ground on democracy and lost ground on democratic engagement rather than gained it. So that's really, it's a big risk, and it's a process that in that regard. So I just wanted to highlight that, because all of those issues connect right back to Ireland. And I'm going to come back a little bit then just to talk about in terms of Ireland. Ireland is in a funny situation in that in one level we're leading the way on our citizens' assemblies. I like the citizen assembly. I think they're really strong as a modeling of conversation. I still think our electoral system of proportional single transferable vote is the best democratic innovation we can offer to the world. But Ireland has been really strong internationally on civil society. We've really led the way in the UN. In 2018, I had here, just beautiful quotes from the Irish government about the importance of civil society at the UN. We sponsored a motion, indeed, at the UN in which we said, we noted that across the world we called for the promotion protection of civil society space as a foreign policy priority, and noted that across the world we're witnessing a retrenchment of civil society as it comes under pressure through stigmatization, harassment, and even criminalization. So on the one level, Ireland's doing these great things internationally, but sadly, in the last decade, Ireland has also seen a lot of measures that erode civil society space here in Ireland. They've taken a number of forms in terms of funding. A new approach to funding that's very constrained and divides, for example, funding through procurement, where instead of having civil society groups collaborating, they're set into competition with each other. They're very much framed and forced to make a very hard and an inauthentic choice between service provision or advocacy. And knowing that the ability to have funding to deliver essential services to vulnerable groups is actually being set against the capacity to advocate for those groups and for the policy and for the democratic policies that will reflect them. And that's been done through funding. It's been done through the kinds of contracts and procurement that the state does, but it's also been done through the laws. And our own group, the Civil Engagement Group in the Shannon, along with the Coalition for Civil Society Freedom, we've been trying to tackle that issue that, for example, the definition of political purposes in our legislation at the moment effectively curtails charities from engaging in, it was envisaged, and even I think the administrators of the Standards in Public Office, it was envisaged as being about electoral activity. But effectively, the way it's framed has served to curtail, and in quite an ad hoc basis, because it's complaint-based, so the political engagement on political activity by civil society organizations who want to be registered as charities, which is of course crucial for their funding and sustainability. So that's a small legislative change. The government have engaged somewhat with us on it, but that's an important example because that does tie the hands. And we know that there's people who, for example, feel that they can't appear before an Oireachtas committee, even though they know the issues, because they have that direct experience and they're working directly with people, because it could curtail their status or be seen as them politically acting. That's the kind of measure that Ireland needs to address. And it was really notable that actually the Fundamental Rights Agency in Europe listed the very regressive Hungarian laws, which were quite extreme in terms of curtailing civil society, but they also listed that example from Ireland as another example that was constraining civil society activity. And I think that's really important and needs to be addressed, and it needs to be a focus. And of course, then when you have that removal, you also have the difficulties in accessing public funding and a sense more and more of those who receive public funding, be it shouldn't be commenting. And that was not always the case. That's a new norm that has been a little bit embedded. The idea if you get HSE funding, you shouldn't comment on HSE policy, for example. That actually wasn't always the norm, and it's not good either, because what it means is we're separating experience and expertise and saying you have to divide them, rather than recognizing civil society groups can bring us both of those. There is issues then in terms of private funding, because when you're pushed to private funding, the question of who sets the agenda is really important. And we know that a lot of private funding is, for example, much more of a fan of innovation, say, than of addressing injustice. Because innovation has this almost kind of nice, so you do have a curtailment. And of course, the fact is that many private actors' interest, especially in the really hard choices in areas like climate change at the moment, the fact there are tensions between private sector goals and the public good, and they don't always align. It's not just about good ideas, it's about actually, in some cases, a battle for power and priority. And when we curtail civil society's capacity to engage in advocacy, we are actually tipping the balance whereby paid and commercial lobbyists can disproportionately impact and influence decisions. So it's not a zero-sum game. And when it comes back to democracy, we actually as well are continuing to dilute that connection between, so not a lot of people come into politics and democracy and advocacy directly. They come in because they care about an issue. They're concerned about something locally. They're passionate about disability rights. They need to see that connection of being involved in civil society groups and having civil society groups say, we're actually taking on a policy goal now. It becomes an evolution and an empowerment. So I just wanted to kind of highlight those concerns. I know I'm probably running out of time. There's too much to say in this area, but I do want to say two pieces, because I noticed we have the ILDN here. Actually, community development projects are so important, and they're also part of what was constrained, because they were spaces for that upward setting of the agenda from communities. I think they're a really important piece that's lost. And another piece that is getting eroded is on planning. Again, so, in the one level, citizen assemblies are good, but there is what I would call almost a cul-de-sacing, where sometimes people get rooted into surveys, ever more narrower and directive surveys with very narrow sets of choices. It's exactly that agenda setting that David described, even within departmental consultations. It's always important to have that other space and other ideas part, but at the curtailment in terms of the agenda setting, and yet at the same time, a chipping away of already very hard won space for civil society to engage, for example, in areas like planning, which is probably one of the most direct. That's the end. My final point, I would say the positive. I think civil society has held on to the idea of principles. They are the ones who have fought for the best and meaningful. And there's a lot of civil society groups who basically said, we're going to take the climate Paris goals seriously. We're taking the biodiversity goals seriously. Who they are effectively, insisting on that as the agenda. And there is much more international cooperation than there ever has been. And while there's a lack of trust, because democracy is nascent, the legacy of colonialism is only now barely being addressed. I regard a lot of European countries as evolving democracies, because they're only beginning to recognize at all the legacy of colonialism and what that part of it. But the conversations between civil societies globally on holding their governments, each other's governments to account, on, for example, having a common language like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as a common language that's shared. So there's reference points we can go back to. Things like climate justice and just transition being placed alongside each other. Civil society can lead in terms of tackling evasions, tackling the kicking of issues to the side. And I think that's something that is positive and empowering. And on that, we've seen on the TRIPS waiver, where again, it is civil society organizations who are demanding equality around vaccine access and that solidarity, because I think they can see the global connections. So thank you very much. Sorry if I spoke too long.
So thank you so much, Senator Higgins. The chat box is starting to move into overdrive with questions and comments. So I'm going to get straight to it. first question I want to raise is how can civil society organizations raise public awareness as to their importance for sustaining democracy in general, but also putting pressure on governments to improve public services and provide sufficient financial support for those in need and to respond to community interests? I want to pose that question along with a comment that's come in as well and put it straight to you, Senator Higgins. I think procurement processes and a particular EU governance of procurement is now being used as a catch-all excuse for Irish civil service to deny funding to civil service organisations. This is an area in which you've moved some parliamentary activity. So you might just relate that to the wider question of CSOs raising public awareness for themselves and in the protection and furtherance of democracy.
I think first of all, I won't, sorry, I'm muted, I think. Yeah, no, here I am. I'm not going to go into procurement policy. We'll be here a long time, but it is an example, and it is not the case. That's an example whereby EU laws have been referenced. In fact, the EU procurement laws explicitly state that public procurement can be a tool in terms of social and environmental goals. So there's lots and lots of choices, and that's one of the good things from things like the Citizen Assembly at the Future of Europe process, where you have 200 citizens from different countries sitting alongside each other, is that the same excuses being trotted out in different places can almost get called out. It is not the case that EU procurement laws constrain us on that. And in terms of, I do think civil society organizations have a really, really important role in raising awareness of themselves. I think one thing that organizations need to do is to recognize that they might need to work in multiple ways. So not to get cul-de-saced, so that you don't get constrained to simply, some of the professionalization, the idea of like, you're either presenting to the committee or you're on the streets. The reality is a lot of civil society organizations need to be doing both, and civil society and social movements need to be doing both, and to realize it's not necessarily the other person at the committee who might be presenting from a particular sectoral or business interest who is that actually the protest that's out on the street is part of your alliance. So I think that's one thing of a flexibility to be able and to insist on agenda setting. So one of the key things is to challenge the frames in terms of when you're being asked to input, to say, these are other issues I need to raise. I want to trace the decision further up. I'm wondering, what are the pre-assumptions in this engagement? And I'm going to let others come in, so I'm conscious I spoke.
Yeah. So turning to the glass half full men, David and Richard, same question. You've made some comments in relation to the work that CSOs themselves are doing positively in this regard, but are there more? And I'm conscious of Richard's particular reference to the influence of new social movement methodology on political party formations, but then cautioned that it has not been followed through or has led to some disappointment. So we need to nail this down, a methodology that is robust and can permeate right through the political system for this. So throwing it open to yourselves.
I might have a first go because I'll stick to my particular focus, whereas Richard is ranging more widely. But I completely agree with one of the things. I completely agree with Richard and all the other contributors. But one particular point that Richard was saying was, the sort of processes that I was outlining about civil, citizens' assemblies and the like. I was focusing on the government-sponsored ones because they're the ones that are most interest to me. But he's absolutely correct. There are really good examples of where civil society groups have used deliberative mini-publics like citizens' assemblies to promote a debate. We saw this in Belgium in 2011 with the G1000, where they provoked a debate about the failures in Belgian democracy. And a decade later, we're now seeing huge reforms right across Belgium, a lot of them being driven by the same G1000 people because the politicians finally woke up to it and listened to it. And so I would be suggesting one thing that perhaps civil society groups like the ones involved in these conversations might want to consider is using the Citizens Assembly model, putting it to the Irish political elite. You know, you guys are talking about how great Ireland is because we're using these things. Right, we're going to run our own. We're going to find the funding. Alice Mary has said that it's not as easy as it might seem, but we're going to get the funding. We're going to get professionals to run these things, and we're going to run a Citizens Assembly to try and set an agenda, whether it's on housing or local infrastructure or something else like that. But it's going to be a robust, well-run process, and we're going to get cooperative politicians to buy into that agenda. Take it to them. That's what I would suggest.
Thanks, David. Richard?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would say that's in line with, I think one thing that civil society organizations are already beginning to do, following on from Lisa's initial remarks as well. I think there is a recognition among civil society activists that previously they organized themselves in perhaps an overly formalized way that didn't link in particularly well with the broader pool of citizens engaged with particular issues. That civic activists were quite professionalized, very dedicated to their particular issues, but it left outside a wider sphere of people. That now I think the newer forms of civic organization are beginning to find ways of engaging with the broader public and raise that public awareness that you were talking about. I think there's still a long way to go. We're still in quite an exploratory form, but even in terms of the big amounts of international funding that is available for these kind of civic innovations, things have changed, and money is beginning to get more to the grassroots level, to newer forms of organization that I think have begun to link up in more organic ways with local. That's not to over-idealize the situation. There is a long way still to go. There's lots of civil societies in many countries around the world that haven't innovated very much, that are still adhering to quite traditional models, very hierarchical organization, that look a bit detached from the wider population. But I think things are beginning to move. Encourage more movement in that direction, joining together some of the deliberative techniques that David and others have with the looser forms of social movement, but also recognizing the more formal kinds of civil society organization also can bring a lot to the table, in particular in joining these bottom-up dynamics in the political sphere as well.
Thanks for that, Richard. Lisa, you have been painted as being in the glass half empty category, but I know from your earlier contribution, you have plenty of positive and practical examples of from the ground up activity on this. What's your perspective on this question?
Sure. Thank you. I'm a strong believer that sometimes, I mean, you can't see the stars except in great darkness, and there are lots of stars, and we've heard a number of them this afternoon. And I would add a few. I think one of the most intriguing opportunities for civil society, we tend to draw, I think, many civil society organizations on research conducted in sort of the policy sphere, so political science related research. And I think some of the most interesting integration of behavioral insights and behavioral research coming from social psychology and behavioral economics into the work that civil society organizations are doing, I think there's a lot of hope there. And just sort of one example of that, if you read some of the work done by people like Cass Sunstein and some of my colleagues, Dr. Lauren Van Berkel, Cassidy Irvin, Dr. Erin Barno, others, they're looking at how to apply real innovations when we assume that actors are rational. So when we assume in our advocacy or civil society advocacy that you're dealing with complete rationality in some cases, and in some cases research is based on that assumption. And I think it's helpful to explore what experts in behavioral economics understand about how we act as individual human beings. And one example of that, I think, in relation to supporting and helping our counterparts in government be more responsive, are using tested things like commitment devices, where government officials commit to having meetings with citizens. And some of the fantastic innovations that Professor Farrell was talking about that I look forward to learning more about. I think the opportunities are endless with that, and I agree with Professor Young's in his assertion that civil society is incredibly creative. And I wanted to it's funny for people who know me because I'm very much a glass half full person by nature, but I think one of the things that we haven't talked about that I think a number of people on this panel probably specialize in, and people on this call, is the use of humor in our work. And the civil society organizations that I've worked with around the world really draw, I mean, if you look at some of the collective action done by CSOs in Serbia, for example, during the Milosevic era, a lot of it was based on using humor to keep them out of jail. And I think there are these tremendous opportunities that are really evidence-based, but really I go back to the encouraging the integration of the behavioral insights into civil society work. Because I think it's relatively unexplored in the way that kind of the integration of political science is, and I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Lisa. We're at 5:15 now. We have approximately 15 minutes, so I'm going to move on to some other questions and just to ask panelists maybe to contribute on a very brief basis. We don't have that long for the connection, so I'll move straight on. We've touched on this question briefly in the contributions thus far, and it's about the role that large business, especially multinational corporations, can play. So one audience member has said that they would welcome reflections from the panel on the role that large business can or should play in promoting or strengthening democracy, and particularly referencing their buying and procuring power, particularly from countries where democracy may be weaker as well. And that question is echoed by a number of people in the chat. So I'm going to start with Richard on this.
I think I just restrict myself to one specific comment on the business side, and that is that I think one problem civil society has around the world, particularly in developing states, is that of finding locally generated funds. Civil society's reliance on international funds makes it vulnerable. It enables regimes to spin a narrative that civil society are agents of foreign powers. Civil society organizations have recognized this danger since many years ago, and they've tried to put in place alternative funding models based on their providing services to local communities and enabling them to raise funds from local businesses, members of local communities, so that they are not reliant on international funds. But they have still not moved that far in that direction. I think that's where the international community can lend more help. I think it's this kind of creative thinking that should be part of the Summit for Democracy that will be held this week. It's not simply a question of throwing more international money at civil society, but helping local organizations think through more sustainable models of funding, often in collaboration with local businesses. There's a lot more to be said on the relationship between private sector and states, but I think I'll just limit myself to that one point that I think is particularly important.
Thanks, Richard. And I'm going to move on your suggestion of one comment per panelist and go straight to David on the same question of the role of business.
My comment will be very quick. I don't have anything significant to contribute, so I'm happy to pass on to somebody else.
Liza?
I would offer one positive comment, which is that I think we're seeing in some cases a sort of separation of the wheat from the chaff of businesses that are willing to stand up and put their profit margins on the line to support democratic policies and civil society organizations than those that are not. And I think highlighting those and continuing to highlight those in social media is critically important to set the incentives for profit-making ventures to recognize their role in supporting and upholding democracy.
Yeah, so I'm going to grab David's comment and have two, because one is, yes, there is a space there, and I think it can be, but it is really how that funding comes is really important. So for example, is there what I would call solidarity funding, where you're funding ground up and space initiatives, or is it showcase funding? Because where you have showcase funding, we know that there is that thing where corporations who, like I say, certain kinds of projects are what they like, they can be showcasing, and it can be a real dilemma for organizations because you don't want to be part of, greenwashing or social washing in that sense. I think a lot of small NGOs find themselves in that bind, where if their service provisions they're getting, that's why I think tackling that issue of advocacy is important, because otherwise service providers can't advocate, and those who advocate often need to access private funding and have the potential constraints that come with that. So that's to be said. But something I just wanted to it's a really important thing about civil society is while it is lacking in funding, citizens, the people en masse in their collective, as is represented by civil society, have something that large corporations don't have, which is power and vote. You might be the biggest corporation in the world, but you only have a certain number of votes in any election. And I think it's really important that that capital, this is going back to a former TASC lecture from Piketty, and I'm answering this question, which I saw in the chart too, that you don't have a situation where, because you have capital, you can effectively control the funding of the organizations and civil societies and of these large collective groupings, which are civil society. Capital shouldn't be able to overtake them, because at times the interests of capital, in the bluntest sense of private capital, are not necessarily the same as the public interest. And in fact, it's almost those core dynamics of business, the economy sitting inside society, sitting inside environmental and planetary boundaries. And I actually think some businesses really do understand that. They see that that's where they're located. But I know that others sometimes could see their corporate model and then environment and society as little subsections within that, as so far as they don't challenge the economic model. And I think it's a really important thing, but that framing matters in terms of authentic and non-detrimental engagement.
Okay, thanks, Senator. You've mentioned the Piketty word, and we're going to move straight on with it. I'm not going to bring you in on this one because you've already answered it. And I'm going to confine my other guests to 1 minute each on it. The question is it possible that the continuation of neoliberal economic policies might contribute to a diminution of democracy in the coming decade? I would be hoping for a yes or no, but I'll give you 30, 60 seconds each. Richard?
And that's such a huge question. I'm going to obliquely avoid it and come at it from a different angle and say, I think the pandemic is probably slowly taking us beyond the era of neoliberal economics. I think perhaps not completely, but at least to some measure. And I think now the focus is on much more state intervention. We're perhaps entering an era of big government. Even centre-right parties are ramping up spending related to post-COVID recovery needs. So I think the debate will actually be more about how the expansion of state competences sit with democracy. In some respects, that could be good news for democracy if underlying social and economic inequalities are addressed to a greater extent. That could give democracy a firmer footing in many places of the world. But I think it would be essential that as state competencies grow, so measures of accountability are ramped up to accompany the growth of state competencies. And that's not always happening. Others, David and Lisa both mentioned developments at the European level, the Senator as well. We're seeing quite a large expansion in spending at the European level that is not yet mirrored by accompanying measures of democratic accountability that could in the longer term be of quite some concern in countries like Ireland and other countries receiving such funding.
Okay, fascinating possibilities there. Let's hope the opportunities you talk about are grasped in a positive way that's possible. Lisa?
I don't have a lot to add on this question. I will say that I wish we were having more of those debates in the United States, and I think we're sort of mired in the debates of what can get done in the Congress in terms of passing budgets more than the theoretical side of it. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
Great, thanks, David. I'm going to move on if you're...
Oh, I'm sorry, I went out. Did you ask me to, Joe? Beg your pardon. There was the storm, I think. I'm not a political economist, so I can't comment on Piketty or any of that kind of stuff. But I suppose one thing I might suggest that it's not perhaps a million miles, it's from my own perspective, is, a sense that in some quarters that perhaps the future for democracy is less democracy, it's technocracy. It's letting the experts take over because they know best, and don't worry the little people with those sorts of things. And I think one of the wonderful things that democratic innovations around the world is proving is that is exactly the wrong answer. The solution to our democratic problems is more democracy. And whether it's in a neoliberal context or any other socioeconomic context, that's the thing that certainly I would be arguing we should be focusing on. More of this, please.
Thanks, David. I'm going to move on to a very fundamental.
Yes.
Thanks. There's a fundamental question which many of us involved in civil society organizations that have any international perspective or relations will be well aware of. It's this: what can be done to counter trends in countries such as Russia, Belarus, etc., where civil society organizations are increasingly being labeled foreign agents or extremist organizations, and where leaders and even members are increasingly fined, jailed, or, we scroll down, exiled. In other words, when open war is declared on civil society, how can we fight back? And in answering the question, I think we allied to it, another that's come in is just, how is our democratic health here in Ireland? Are there trends that we need to see in a similar prism to what's going on elsewhere? I'll start with yourself, Lisa, because you've keen experience of these dangers.
Sure, just in the interest of time, a very brief response on that first question. I think the first and most fundamental thing is listening to the activists in the countries themselves and taking seriously the warnings that they provide and providing sort of ongoing standing support to them. And I think, as I said, that can be rhetorical in some cases, but it can also be providing assistance from a legal perspective, whether it's drawing on international law and concepts or drawing on the laws of the state that they live in. And obviously those are fraught for many reasons and very hard to do. And I think it's one of the fundamental challenges of our time is that it requires creativity at the core, creativity because every context is different. And, you know, I mentioned the research that Navalny and his organization had done, and now he's in prison. So there are very real consequences for civil society organizations that work on these issues. I think the foreign agents law is its own particular issue that we could discuss for a long time. My understanding is we have a similar law in the United States requiring, but the intent is and I think that's one of the challenges that we have to face as well, is sometimes the intent of the passage of certain laws that are sort of under the banner of, but it's used in democracies as well when it's passed for an illiberal reason, I think is something that we need to continue to listen to civil society activists in real time as those laws pass, because sometimes that's when you can actually reverse them or before they pass. I could continue on this topic for quite a while, but I think that's one of the most important ways that we can do it.
I might just add that I do think things like the United Nations principles are really important there because they do counteract some of that narrative. It makes it, if it's a matter of power, if we're in a politics of power and a sets of client states, then it's much easier for those arguments to gain traction. Whereas when you're talking about things like UN charters, the SDGs, the new human right to a healthy environment, that becomes useful as giving a tool that can be cross-referenced without and allow civil society to directly support civil society, sometimes essentially having to bypass government on that.
Richard, I'm going to ask you to make a final contribution on that question.
It's a really difficult challenge. I think that Lisa mentions all the right things. I would just say that in addition, I think these actors need help to build up a wider set of alliances domestically. They're now not in a situation to receive big amounts of project funding. That's a traditional way of giving support to these organizations. They perhaps need more political support, more symbolic support. We found in Carnegie that what they want is to be included in international networks, feel that they're not alone, they've got some solidarity behind their efforts. It's a very, very difficult policy equation. We also find that the world of civil society support needs to be linked a bit with Western powers' geopolitical strategies as well. It's no good protesting about Navalny on the one hand and then building oil pipelines, gas pipelines on the other hand. Those two levels really do need to be joined together.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. Finally, because we are up against time, I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to put on their long-term telescopic lenses for the moment. And one question has come in, which is mirrored in a few places. What would you consider to be the principal long-term threats to civil society? And this will be our wind-up question. Again, I'm asking you to keep your comments brief, but if you could address that question, plus any other final comments you wish to make. I'm going to start, because she opened for us with Lisa, again. Thanks.
Sure, and I'm actually going to reinforce something that Professor Young said, which is I believe complacency is the biggest threat. And I think the complacency of people who live in democracies and it's now on us to, as civil society actors, as in government, to take on those charges. And I certainly did not mean to sound negative in my opening remarks, but I do believe that unless, particularly in democracy, we take that role seriously. And again, we do it with humor and poetry, that we're not serving those who are living in authoritarian countries or backsliding democracies. So I thank you all for joining. Recognize the role of every person on this call in doing that, and the important work of TASC Network. And I look forward to being in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Senator Higgins.
Sorry, I maybe add to the complacency. I think both complacency and cynicism are the two poles I always think, which are very disempowering. And in fact, the space that we need to be in is challenge. And I think that civil society is one of the strongest, most authentic tools for challenge. And I think it would be, if we lost, and also to be aware of the power that you have in terms of challenge. So I think civil society, if civil society was to lose sense of the actual connection that it has, the challenge that it can offer, the mandate that comes from that kind of connection to the ground, I think that would be detrimental. And I do think that, the biggest threat in the next period of time is that the interests of the many will not necessarily align with the interests of the few in terms of particularly climate change. And that is a fact whereby all instruments whereby people can connect or reach decisions are going to be really important. And they need to sometimes not be invited into those rooms, but demand access into decision-making rooms. So that's that kind of challenge, which I think maybe it's more of an optimistic thing. I think that's the solution for civil society. And I think that's how civil society will in fact help us through what is a really difficult period ahead.
Thank you. David?
I'd add misinformation is another huge threat. And, as democracies are evolving from being, the traditional vote-centered, every 4 years we get to kick the rascals out kind of a democracy, to being more voice-centered with deliberative processes and participatory processes and the role of civil society. I think more than ever, what we need is informed voices. So everything we can do to push back against misinformation, I think, is crucial. And
final word to yourself, Richard.
I agree, complacency, but also apathy, that governments slowly and undramatically tighten the screw on civil society organizations, and the wider population does not react because they don't see what is being lost. That regimes manage to spin this narrative that civil society is somehow synonymous with political opposition, and civil society actors don't make the case that the wider sphere of the population actually needs a vibrant, active civil society, and that a vibrant civil society is not about political opposition.
So there you have it, 4 unique and expert voices with insight into the key question that we were discussing this evening. I have left the last question on long-term threats there as I suppose it's a deliberate not ending on the positive, because we have come together today because of a threat to something we all hold dear. So I'm letting you leave the virtual room with some of those warnings cascade around you, but also to remind you that we've heard some very positive and practical examples of how this agenda has been pushed back and will continue to be pushed back. And I hope we can all redouble our efforts to stay alert, stay cautious, and to be active in the solutions that have been proposed this evening. My final word is, my second final word is to thank everybody, to thank our 4 speakers, to thank our several hundred audience, and to thank the TASC staff, John, Shana, and colleagues who have, in a technological, spiritual, and moral way, supported those of us that have been in front of camera this evening. And then my final word is to say that in an Irish context, the health of democracy the health of TASC is the health of democracy. There is an opportunity for small-scale donations through the chat, the link put in the chat box, which I hope people might consider at some stage. TASC has made considerable efforts over the last few years to become, I suppose, more accessible to more organizations and more individuals, and to broaden the basis of our support. So indeed, today's event has been part of that. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for a very insightful 20th anniversary lecture, focusing on, again, a key theme for our era and epoch. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again engaged at some TASC event, meeting, webinar, or whatever platform you choose to engage with us in. So thank you. Ihawa agus Quinnaby Slán Sisterum. Good night, everyone.